everybody, it's Claire here from Sewing by Claire, and today I wondered if anybody might like to have a go at making the winter cape. The winter cape is in book 1, and I should have got the page ready. Sorry, I got Luna in my hand at the time, and it's on page 102 and 103, and this is what it looks like in the book. As I say, it's in book 1, Luna Lapin making, and this is my cape that I've made. So I chose not to do it in the red to start off with. I've chosen this lovely floral corduroy, which I thought looked quite autumnly, well, autumn and winter like. We've still got the pom-pom trim, so I show you how to sew with this pom-pom trim as well, and how to neatly finish the slits for the arms and the slits for the ears. The other thing that I've done with this one, if I can just undo this quickly, is because the way that Sarah's written the pattern is really nice and neat, and it's got a full lining in it, then it actually can make it reversible. So I'm just, while we're talking, just turning this around just to show you what I mean by that. Because if I just do up her hook and eye on her neck, which I've just made difficult for myself, and I'll show you why in a minute. And then I can poke her hands through so you can see. So I should be doing it on camera, shouldn't I, so you can see what I'm doing. But there we go, we have the reversible cape. Poor Luna can't see out properly, can you there, hey? So, if you wanted to have a go at making this, but maybe you were a little bit daunted by the hood, maybe a bit daunted by the pom-pom trim, then this video is for you. And as I say, I made it reversible just by covering I don't know if you can see it, but there's 2 buttons there covering the hook and eye so that they're not visible from either side. So if you fancy having a go at making the winter cape with me, then keep watching, because that's the right video and that's what we're going to be doing today. So first things first, we've got the instructions of how to make the winter cape on page 104, 105, and then that continues over to page 6 and 7, 106 and 7 as well. But we also need to get to the pattern pages. So the pattern is actually on page, I did find it earlier and then I've lost it again, sorry. Now, pattern starts on page 137 with this piece here, which is the side front, and then continues here with the back, the front hood and the back hood, and that makes up all the pieces. There might be a few more pieces than you've used to having used in the back. The other thing is there is an erratum in the book as well. So this piece here, which is actually upside down, is the winter cape back. And in your book it'll say, or it could say, cut 2 in main fabric, cut 2 in lining. But actually you only need 1 in main fabric and 1 in lining, because that you place this on the fold and it'll open out to make the 1 back piece that you need. So just let you know with that, everything else is cut out too. So the next thing that you need to do then is to get your tracing paper. And then you're going to pop it over the top of your pattern and you're going to trace it out. Now, I have also heard that on the publisher's website you can actually get a download of the pattern pieces without actually having to trace them off. The only one that I had problems with tracing was this piece here, the front hood, because I really had to open out the spine in order to get this line down here on the back bit here. So just be aware of that. Make sure that you're trying to trace as accurately as possible, and once you've cut them out, just pop your pattern pieces back over the top of your the markings in the book, and just make sure that you've traced those correctly and cut them out correctly and that they fit. The other thing that's very important with this pattern as well is that you mark all of your little triangles, the little notches here, and that you also mark these lines here, which is the grain line, and that tells us the direction that the fabric needs to lay on the fabric. No, I said that wrong. The direction that the pattern needs to lay on the fabric, because when we're cutting it out we want to be straight of grain for this, either north to south or south to north, it doesn't matter which way, but we need that to be in line with the selvage edge, which we've said before is the bound edge of your fabric. If you've not got one, then just have a look at the way that the threads are running and choose one way, but have all of your pattern pieces going the same way. And that's going to be really important for me as well, because I'm going to use a fabric that's got something called a nap to it, so that's NAP. And a nap is, I'm using corduroy for mine, but if you're using velvet or a velour, then if you run your hand down it one way, then it can get, it'll show a certain shading, and then if you turn your hand the other way, it'll show a different shading. So that's something just you can Google it or what is a fabric nap, and you'll get probably a better description than I've just given you, but that's enough to know, and we'll talk about that when we're working with our fabric as well. So so make sure you've got all of your pattern pieces. You need to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 traced out from your book, and then we'll be ready to go. So these are the fabrics that I've chosen to use for mine. This is a lovely needle cord. It's got very fine lines, like they call them wales on needle cord, and that's a really nice, I feel, a nice wintry design on there. And then I've chosen a corresponding red fabric for the lining, which will make a nice contrast for that. The pattern itself does call for brush cotton, but any quilting weight cotton or cotton that you've got will be good enough and do a nice job for it. And again, whilst I've chosen this needle cord, which will give us a degree of complexity to use, just because we've got to make sure that all the pieces are either going one way or the other way, in line with these little lines on. I don't know if you can see the little lines on there, but there's little, like, they call them wales on there. But we'll talk about that as we're working. And then if you did want to make yours in, as I say, in a velvet, then you'd be able to follow those tips and tricks as well to make yours work. And then the other thing I've got, I didn't have any white pom-poms, and this is bigger than the pom-pom trim that is in the kit supplied by Cool Crafting. So again, the author of the book, Sarah Peel, who's here, who's the designer of Luna Lapin and her wardrobe, she's got a craft and sewing knitting shop called Cool Crafting, which is up in Cumbria. I think it's Cumbria. I'll put some details in the thing anyway. And from her website, you can choose either a make me kit, which includes a pattern, or a remake kit, which gives you everything you need except the pattern. So if you've got the book, you don't need the pattern because it's already in there, but obviously you might need, but the trim that she uses, I'm waffling, aren't I? Sorry. The trim that she uses in the book for the cape is this really fine one here, and I've not got any of that. So I'm going to use this one instead. So it's a bit bigger. It might not be quite as nice, and we'll see how it looks, because we'll pin it in place first and have a little look. And if I don't like it, then I might either switch it out and not use it at all, or I'll use a rick rack. But I thought for the purposes of this tutorial, it would be nice for you to know how to sew with this kind of a trim. So that's why I'm including it now, even though it's not quite perfect. But I think it's close enough that we'll be able to get away with it. So next stage then is to look at cutting out your pattern. Now, as I say, if you're using a velvet or thing, you've got to be aware that if you run your hand down one way on your fabric, it's nice and smooth. If you rub your hand down the other way, it's rough. And so we want all of the smoothness all going down, or all of the roughness going down, whichever you prefer. And that's where these grain lines go on. Now, you only will have a little grain line like this one on your pattern, but all I've done is I've just extended that piece, that line, as far as I can do up the pattern piece, because that'll make sure that we've got it straight, and I'll show you how to measure it to make sure we've got that straight on the pattern piece, on our fabric. So yes, when you've got those, and this one you'll see is slightly at an angle as well, and that it means that when we lay this on the fabric, we need to lay it slightly at an angle. We wouldn't lay it like that, because that's not how the designer has designed it. So we do need to lay it with the line being straight, not the pattern piece being straight. So again, this is just all picking up the tips for the fabric that you're using and for the markings on a pattern. And these patterns are the same whether you're doing a children's or an adult's garment as well, so that all makes sense and is the same. The other thing we've got is some dots that we need to mark, and we'll be making Tailors Tacks to mark those when we get onto them. And there's a few of those, and they're really important because on the hood they'll leave room for the ears to be open and for the ears to pop out for Luna or for Wilhelmina or your eared characters. And then further down on the front of the cape here, these are the slits actually where the arms are going to poke through. So we do need to be marking these, and I'll show you how to mark them with thread using a tailor's tack. That's the method I prefer, rather than using a pen or a pencil or some sort of friction pen, but because it can leave a mark on your fabric. But if you wanted to use Frixion pens, and we can talk about how you do that as well at that stage. So just make sure when you're copying your pattern, you've got all of your triangles, your notches and your dots and your grain lines marked, because we will be using those and they are really important. Okay, let's talk about cutting out our fabric. So one tip I've got for you is that if you start with your lining fabric, then you get a good practice at cutting out and becoming familiar with with how your pattern is and how it needs to sit on your fabric before you cut into your main fabric. That's based on the fact that, or the assumption, should I say, that quite often your lining fabric might be slightly cheaper than your main fabric is. It just depends on what you're using and in order to make your cape, and only you'll know that. This is what I was meaning by talking about the selvage edge. So this is the bound edge that you sometimes find on fabric. Sometimes it's printed like this, sometimes it's bound like this, and possibly the colour goes right up to the edge. On this piece it's been cut from a fat quarter, so I haven't got the other side, but that's what we're going to be using as our guide. So this is where we're going to be measuring from for our pattern pieces. So when we talk about lying things on pattern, either with the grain or without, so here we've got a grain line, so that would lie straight north to south, because that's the way that the line is pointing, the grain line, and then we can use the grain line to measure from the grain line to the point on the selvage edge, and that will tell us top and bottom whether this piece is straight or not, and then we can pin at the top and the bottom, and then we know, carry on pinning, we know we're straight. So apologies if you already know that. I know I go over some things quite a lot on my videos, but I never know if this is the first video you're watching or if it's the 10th video you're watching, so I try to include as much as possible if I can, as you hopefully know. So on this, so whereas this line is going straight north to south and would lie that way on the fabric, this one here, look, is at a diagonal, so therefore I would lie that one at a diagonal on the pattern piece at a diagonal, but the line would still be straight, and I would still use my tape measure, and I would still measure from the bottom of the fabric, so that's 11.5 centimetres, can make that 11.5, and then go to the top of the fabric and it's less than 11.5. So then I now know that that line isn't straight, so I can just twist it out slightly at the top, and again measure again, and we're 11.5 there now. So now I know I could pin with confidence, knowing that that is at the right angle for that pattern piece. Just flick that bit of video back if you're not sure, if that's not made sense. But basically you want the same measurement from your line, which is why your line needs to be accurate and drawn as it is on the pattern. You can't just draw that line anywhere, and then measure across to a point on the edge of your fabric at the top and the bottom of the line, and the measurement should be the same to the same reference point on the side. That will tell you that your pattern piece is straight as the designer intended it. Okay. Hopefully that's all made sense. So what we're going to do now is we need one piece to be cut out on the fold, and then we're going to need to have, again, we've spoken about this before, we need to have mirrored pieces of some of these fabrics because they aren't symmetrical. So I'm going to fold my fabric in half and use it that way, because I cut out two mirrored copies. If I put the two right sides together, then when I put my pattern piece on and cut it out, I'll automatically get the two mirrored pattern pieces. If you're short on fabric, then sometimes it can be more economical to cut your pattern pieces out singly, but just be aware you'll need one cut out this way, and you'll need to turn your pattern piece over to cut out your second piece, because otherwise if you cut out two like that, they won't be mirrored copies, and you need a left and a right, and this way you'd end up with two lefts or two rights, and you need to have one of each. So we've talked about that before, and I think there is a video of mine as well on mirroring pattern pieces when you're cutting out fabric, so that you can go and have a look at that again video, if that makes sense. So let's fold this piece of fabric in half, and we're going to try and keep that selvage edge visible for me. I've used it for a bit of a plique look before, and I've got this cut edge and it's running roughly in line with that selvage edge line there as well. So then we can look at our pattern pieces, and this fabric, has it got a directional print? Yes, it has. Okay, so I want to have all of those flowers going up, so I've turned my fabric this way because it's a directional fabric piece. Let's just hope I can get everything out. It does make things slightly more difficult All it means is if you think of I've got flowers on this pattern here. Can you see all of these up here? And they're all heading up one direction. There's none of them are facing down the other way. So that means that this fabric is what's called directional. And unless I want some of my flowers to be down and some to be up, I'd prefer them all to be the same way. Then I need to just pay attention to that when I'm cutting out my fabric. So I've turned it round so they're all facing upwards. If you've got a fabric where you've got some flowers up and some down, it won't matter. You can just carry on with what you're doing. And I'm just going to place the first one, the biggest piece, which is the back. I'm going to place that one first on that centre fold. And I'm just going to pin that one in place. Again, if you're familiar with pinning and cutting out your fabric, you can fast forward on. I've put some timestamps in the video description, so you can just jump ahead if you want to. And also I think on the time bar you can choose which bit you go on to next, so if you're familiar with this then you can do. But if you're a beginner at cutting out fabrics and pattern pieces, then watch on if you want some help. So that's that piece there. Now let's look at the next big piece, which is going to be this one. And again, we're trying to save as much fabric as we can do, so I'm going to bring this one down towards the fold, but just leave a little gap so we can nip off that edge. And again, we can either now measure for our grain line across from our grain line here to the fold, or we can measure back again to the selvage edge. But because we're so close to the fold here, I'm going to use that as my straight line. So let's move that into, so that's 3 centimetres away from the edge. So that's one, and I'm going to just get my pins. Put a pin at the bottom just to hold that still for me and steady. Fabric's just bunching up a little bit as that goes through. And then again at the top of this line here, we want to make sure, and this is slightly off, look, so we can then just move this piece here slightly back until the 3 centimetre mark is on the edge, and then we can be sure that as long as that is all nice and smoothed, and that I've not just moved it, and I haven't, then we can pop a pin in the top here as well, and that will hold it in place. Now we can then go ahead and put in the rest of our pins, because we know if you start at the top and start to pin down the side, sometimes you can take your fabric off being on grain if you've not realised. So that's the way that I do it, and it just means that then you've got your fabric just stays where you want it to be, and you don't have to start and fiddle with it, or it twists when it's being worn later. Oops, got a piece of thread there. Okay, keep your fingers crossed, folks. This might be a bit tight on fabric, but hopefully we'll be okay. So this is our diagonal piece, and actually that, oh no, it's not going to fit in there, is it? Let's just see if we can do it the other way. Oh, just. But that line's off. So I think what's going to happen is, let's take this piece off, because I think we can put this piece up there. See, this sometimes it's a bit of a Jenga, not Jenga, isn't it? It's Tetris, isn't it, that we have to do. So we'll turn that piece, oh, we can't turn it upside down because it's directional. Okay, I might not be able to use this fabric for my lining. Or I'll have to do it singularly and cut it out so I can use this piece here. Let me have a play, hold on 1 second. Okay, so I've just had a quick fiddle around. I've moved some things around in order to fit it in. So I've moved my back piece down the bottom here and pinned that in line with the grain line. I'm then going to put this piece here down here. And again, sometimes it's just trial and error, especially if you're using offcuts or scraps of fabric. You just need to be able to do the best you can in order to get it right. The things that I won't compromise on are things like the grain lines. That absolutely has to be as the designer has intended. So let's just pop these pins in here and just hold those still. The diagonal one is the one that's causing me a little bit of an issue, but it does follow the same line as that one. So by tucking it into the front piece, then we can then use that quite effectively then to match. and that would help with pattern matching as well if you've got a pattern match. This is not a garment that I would suggest you use for a stripe at all. I think that this off-centered front piece is just going to throw off any lines that you might have, so you might just want to reconsider. You might want to use it for a lining perhaps, unless you're more advanced and a bit more au fait than even I am. Won't fit in there. That one might just fit in there. Really close, but we can do it, I think, and then that leaves me plenty then to cut out the top here. So we've managed it. As I say, it's just trying to get it so that we're happy that we've got all of our pieces in and just matching. So I'm just going to mark this up and get this stuck down, and then we're going to get it cut out, and then we can then turn onto our main fabric and then talk about cutting that out. So play around with the fabric that you've got. If you've got a nice clean piece without a bit missing, you should be fine. But as I say, with me, then, or you've got a remake kit, you'll be fine with your fabrics too. But as I say, I'm using what I've got. I had something sent over from the UK the other day. There was a lady I follow, a lady called Kim Porter, and she's got this book here which is Worn and Wash Fabrics, and I ordered that from the UK. I paid for the book and I paid for postage from the UK, and then it cost me another €6.21 to actually collect it from the post office, because they'd deemed that, although I think she put the value on it at slightly less than it was supposed to be, that I paid for it, it still triggered a charge of the €6.21, which, so it does put me off ordering things from the UK, and instead what I tend to do is just buy them when I'm there, or order them and have them sent to my mum's in the UK, and then I can then, it might even fit better that way. No, it can't be upside down, can it, because of the pattern? It's got to be one way. So yeah, so yeah, it just puts you off ordering things. That's the only trouble. That's too long for that. Yeah, so I'm fiddling. Okay, I'll get on with this, and we'll then move on to the main fabric. But sometimes I think it's helpful to see that it isn't always straightforward, and that some people do have problems, or all of us have problems really, just making our fabric fit when we've decided what we want to actually choose. So yeah, jump ahead to the cutting out the main fabric, and I will join you back in a few moments. So the next thing we're going to do after we've got all of our pieces cut out like this is we're going to go around and we're just going to mark any of our notches. So this is the back hood, so we've got 2 notches here, and all we do is where the little triangles are that we've marked on our pattern, we just take the nose of our scissors or our snips, whatever we're using, and we just make a little cut through both layers of the fabric. And when we're matching these up, we'll be able to see those little snips because they're kind of at an angle to the main fabric, and when you open them up you can just see they're there, and they're purposefully there. So just go through all of your pattern pieces and just make those little snips, because they're your match points, and these are the points that we use to match up the jigsaw puzzle that is a sewing pattern. And literally just a couple of millimetres in, you don't need much at all. It's just to mark that we know where those edges are that need to match together. There will never be a notch on a folded edge, so never ever do that. Or if there is, just ignore it, because there shouldn't be, because it would damage the fabric. And 2 more here, look. Okay, so we've got all of our notches marked. The next thing we're going to do now is mark all of the circles that we've got, which are the pattern markings that we saw. And to do that, we do something called a tailor's tack. And I've got a threaded needle, and I've just doubled my thread. Both the ends are the same, but I've not put a knot in the end. And what I do is I take a stitch on either side of the circle, bring my thread through, but you leave a tail. And then I then go at right angles to that, so you're almost doing 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock, whichever order you want, but so long as you go in north, south and east and west. And again, getting caught up on my pins. And you do this before you've removed your pattern, because you have to go through your pattern piece as well. So then I leave a tail. That one's pulled through a little bit. Let's just even that up a bit. Obviously pulled a little bit hard on my thread. And then what we do is you're looking for equal lengths really, and then you snip your thread off, and then you snip through the loop that you made. So you've got all these fluffy bits of thread hanging out, and that is how we want it. That's deliberate. So again, just to show you, we go in on one side and out on the other side of the, without getting it caught on pins, of the dot. So you're on either side of the dot. We're going to leave a tail and then just go the opposite direction over there, and it'll, on the other side, it leaves like a little cross on your fabric, and then you make a loop, but you leave the loop about the same length as your tail. Cut off your needle and thread, leaving a tail, and then you cut through the loop, which leaves a tail. We're going to do that for all of the dots on all of the pattern pieces. I'm just going to show you on this one just to be quick, and then we start to unpin, making sure we don't pull on the threads and pull them out. I have done that before. And then you gently ease your pattern piece off the threads. If they seem like they're getting stuck, just put your thumb on your threads to hold them in your fabric and pull your pattern piece off. Generally it should just come straight away for you like that piece has. And then we can see that those two dots there have now been marked in the correct placement on our fabric. But we've got 2 layers of fabric. As soon as you start to separate these, you're going to pull the thread out and not have your markings. So what we do there, this is why we've left this long bit of thread here. Pull your piece of fabric apart so you can see the threads, and this is why I've used a contrast colour. So you're not going to pull all your threads all the way through. And then when you've got a little bit of a bridge, if you like, of thread, you're going to very carefully just snip in the middle of those, snip through all of them. And then when you pull them apart, you've got your pieces, your places marked on both pieces of fabric. Again with this one, so we're going to pull those apart, but not so much that it pulls the threads completely out, and then snip through those threads just there, and then we can separate those 2 pieces. And we can now see we've got 2 mirrored pieces. We've got a left and a right, and we've got our placement on each of those pattern pieces there for where that dot was on that pattern piece. So that's those 2 pieces there. So if you go ahead and do all of that on each of these pattern pieces, because we've got to remove these pattern pieces in order to use them then for cutting out our main fabric. So all I'd do is just put those 2 together now and put a pin through them to hold them together and pop them somewhere safe, and then move on to the next one. And here we've got a little dot down here. So again, I will just do it exactly the same and just do a little tailor's tack down the bottom here. If you're using a Frixion pen, some people prefer to use those. Let me just find where there's another little dot. Here's one. So on here there's a dot, and what you can do then is take a pin and you can poke your pin through the centre of the dot and then just mark on the back of the dot with your pen. Where's my Frixion pen? It's here. This isn't too bad on the back of the fabric, so you just mark there, just around the dot, just around where your pin is. But you have to then just remember to do it on the other side as well. So for here as well, you just put your little dot there. So it depends what you prefer. I particularly like doing Tailors Tacks. I find them relaxing and it's a nice process. But if you're all about the speed and you're happy that your Frixion pen will iron out of your, because it's heat erasable, iron out of your fabric, then you can mark your dots that way as well, which is a bit speedier. So again, it just depends on what your preference is. So I'm going to carry on marking my dots now, and then I'm going to then work on cutting out the main fabric. See you in a minute. So I'm just about to start to look at cutting out my main fabric, and I've got a lot more of this, which is great, including some odd shaped pieces, because this was a cut left over from doing some children's garment sewing. So what I'm going to do is use these smaller pieces first, but I'm always going to make sure my nap's going in the right direction. So I've just smoothed my hand down it, and I can feel that's the smooth way, that's the rough way. So all of my pattern pieces are going to be with the smooth side facing down. Now this fabric here I'm going to treat as directional as well. It might not be, but it's difficult for me to tell, and I don't want to get it wrong because it's a really pretty fabric, so I'm going to treat them all as being the same way, and I'm going to treat them as doing, see if I can get to that way and to this way. So if your fabric's the same, I might just get my 2 pieces across that way there, and then I'll mirror them for the second piece. So that's what I'm going to do. So again, but this time the grain line I'm going to use to match, I'm going to fold along the grain line, and then I'm going to make sure that that's lying straight across those wales there, and then just fold it back once I've got it straight, and then put a pin in just to hold it still for me. So that's one piece on there, so I can do the same with this one here, because through the tracing paper you can see the line, and then we can line that right up to the edge there as far as it'll go. Make sure that that's straight, and it is, and then unfold it, and they will just fit on that width there, which is fab, because I love being able to just use these smaller pieces of fabric, and that's what I really like about making the Luna clothes, is that they, generally speaking, I mean obviously you can buy brand new fabric and just buy it out, make it out a meterage, but if you've already got some offcuts, and also the other thing is if you were making a garment for a child, sometimes the offcuts are going to be, oh that's not sitting quite straight, sometimes the offcuts are going to be just perfect for making a little matching Luna outfit as well, because some of the little pieces you can then use, can't you? And I just love that idea as well. I think that's a really sweet thing to do. So let me pin these pieces on. I'm always going to be having my nap, the smooth side facing down on this, and I'm just going to mirror some of these smaller pieces, and I'll talk to you about putting the larger pieces on. But if you've got a big nice square of fabric, then just fold it in half so you're getting your 2 mirrored copies. Make sure you've got your fabric all lined the right way, and then pin your fabric on, your pattern pieces on the fabric the same way as we did for your lining fabric. Okay. So just to say that when you finish cutting out your 2 pieces singularly, if you have to do that like I've just done, then when you finish, just pop them one on top of the other and make sure that they're matching still, which these ones will do. Then you can then place your pattern piece on top again and just put a pin on top and bottom just to hold them together for you. And then you can mark them up again with your notches. So we've got 2 notches here on this piece. This is the back hood. We've got 2 notches here. And we've got a dot here. So again, we'll use a contrasting thread. I might use black, I think, for this one. And mark your pieces. And I would do that. So here you see I've cut one out, but I've got one ready. I would do that on each of your pieces, because then when you've finished, you've got your back hood there with your pieces. And then we can then hold those together and keep that together with our pattern, so that we know when we're told what instructions to do with each of them, that we know which bit we're working with. So that's what I would do. So I'll carry on and just turn these the right way, get these the right way round, and mark my tailor's tacks on each one as I'm going, and come back to you when it's all cut out. So I'm just working with the larger pieces here. I've got these 3 larger pieces, and although that's a narrow piece, it's got to be cut on this grain line, so that does make it need a wider piece. So I was only able to use my little off-cutty strange sized bits for the hood, but that's okay, because we're going to move now over onto the main body of the fabric. And what I'm doing here is I still keep checking with my hand to make sure which way is the smooth way, and I feel that's the rough way, this is the smooth way. So I've got my fabric lined on top of each other, and also to make sure that this is straight, we now can fold this back, and if we fold it back and the lines seem to be going into each other like a chevron, we know we're not straight. But if we can line those fabrics up so that they are, and they have a tendency to grab hold of each other as well, corduroy does when it's being worked with, same with velvet as well, then we can start to make sure that we've got that straight, and I'm happy with that is feeling straight on there now. And also the other thing, on the folded edge you can look as well, and you can see, sometimes you can see your lines going off to an angle, and then then you're not straight. But if you try and just sort of eyeball one line down and see if it's following straight, then you can be assured that it is straight. So our winter cape needs to be cut on the fold. I don't want to turn it upside down and get the pattern the other way round, so I'm actually just going to flip it over. We've already cut it out on the line, so I know it's the right shape and size. And so if I just flip it over, then I can still use it the way I want to. Or I could have flipped my fabric over as well, but being as I've got it all lined up this way and I can see this cut edge, I didn't want to do that. Oh, the pins don't want to go through the cord. So just give them a twist if they won't go through, and then that usually enables the threads to, the pins to go through the threads. If you're using right up to the top of a piece of fabric like I am, just look over. I mean, you can see it's slightly off there. So just look on the other side and just make sure that all of your pattern piece is still hitting into fabric, because that again can, as a beginner, that can also just throw you off. And if you've already cut your piece out, then realise you've got 1/2 inch missing off the top here, that can be a bit of a nuisance for you. I'm going to pop this one on top here. So we didn't have to measure the fold line because that goes straight on a fold, and we look to make sure these are straight, the wails are straight. But on this one I am going to measure it because it's going to be important. So from the bottom of the line is 24 centimetres exactly for me. Obviously it'll be different on yours because of your pattern paper, and that's slightly off, that's slightly more than 24. So I know this piece isn't quite straight, so I'm just going to move that top edge out slightly, go back to the bottom again, and that is 24, and go to the top, and that's 24. So before this can move, I do need to just move it down slightly, but literally just slide it down exactly the way it was. I'm going to put a pin at the bottom, and I'm going to put a pin at the top, because then that's going to anchor that in place, that pattern piece in place for me for putting the rest of my pins in. So that's what I'm going to do now. Put the rest of the pins in. And then finally we're going to place the piece that has to go slightly diagonally. Oops, I'll get that one pin in right. Okay. So again, for this one, we can feed it in along the bottom of here, or we can feed it in here. If it was going the other way, I mean, I could do it that way and it goes into that fabric there and uses that offcut up, doesn't it? And that uses that offcut up quite nicely and leaves this whole folder piece. Because if I cut it out there, I'm going to take out a big chunk that I might be able to use for a different project, but just by turning it over here and placing it on the fabric here, making sure that I've missed any of the cuts there. I can still see my pattern markings. It could go up slightly as well. Let's see how straight that one is. Yeah, I think you can see on camera, can't you? So I'm just going to measure this across now, and that's 12 inches exactly, and to the top it's a little bit more than 12, so I'm just going to twist it again to get that to be 12 on the top and on the bottom. But as you can see, I can move it up as I'm, because the angle's changing, I can move it slightly up, so I am doing. Got some room to work with, so that's exactly 12. Let me just put a pin in the top here just to hold it. And let me just go down to the bottom because it keeps shifting slightly as I'm doing it. And that just needs to come slightly that way. 12, yeah. And it's worthwhile getting, I know this is also going to seem like it's a bit pedantic in terms of what we're doing to get it straight, but believe me, if you go on to making adult or children's clothes, and hopefully I'll encourage you all to have a go at that at some stage, then these lunar patterns and garments are a great way just to learn how to handle fabric without the, you know, a bigger risk of making things not quite go as you want to. And you can see the kind of result that you can get, and then it's well worth then learning how to sew. So I've got those on. I've preserved this piece of fabric here. I've gone off into the side there and used that offcut, so I'm happy with that. So now what I'm going to do is cut these out, and we'll mark them up with the notches, and then mark them up with my Tailors Tacks, and then we'll be ready to go to the sewing machine. So once I've got everything cut out, what I normally do is do a bit of a head count just to make sure that we've got all of our pattern pieces cut out. You might think this seems a bit silly or a bit superfluous, but actually you'll just get into the habit of doing it automatically, and it is just a good way of just making sure of everything. So we've got the two parts of the hood, the front and the back, and we've got the two corresponding parts in the lining. We've got the front, the side front and the back of the cape. So we've got the front, the side front and the back of the cape again. So I'm happy that we've got all of the pieces. Now there's a couple of things that are really going to set you up for success with this garment, because it's a fully lined garment, and because we're going to rely on the front and the lining and the outer fabric matching perfectly once we've all sewn it all together. The two most important things are that the first starting point is that all of your pattern pieces, let's use this one because it's quite an easy thing to say, all of your pattern pieces are the same size. I know that's going to sound like it's really obvious because you've used a pattern piece to cut it out from, but what I would do in this case, especially if you're a beginner, is take both of your front and your back pieces and then match those up with your lining front and back pieces, and just make sure that all of them are exactly the same size. The reason being that when we sew with our 1 centimetre seam allowance in the majority part of this, and then this is a classic example, look, I'm just going to show you just this top edge just here. So if we turn that over, I can see that pretty much, with allowing for the nap of the cord, that pretty much covers all of it. But at the top here we've got this little extra bit, so the fabric must have shifted slightly while I was cutting it out. So if I make sure that bottom piece is right, and I'm just going to take my rotary cutter, I'm just going to trim that off to make sure that they're both the right size. So I'm not reducing any of the full size patterns, I'm just taking off anything that's an excess where they don't match. Because when we're doing our 1 centimetre seam allowance, we want to make sure that in all of the places these garments are going to match up. So that's the first thing that I would do, is make sure that all of your pieces are the same size, there's not any little bits flying around that don't need to be there. The second thing that I would do is, when you're sewing, we need to be really consistent with our seam allowances to make sure that they are absolutely spot on as well. So just bear that in mind as well, and now, you know, just bear it in mind. But make sure that your pattern pieces are the right sizes, because if you start off with the wrong size pattern piece, your seam allowance can be as perfect as you like, but it's still going to come out incorrectly, isn't it? So that's why we need to make sure they're right. The next thing I'm going to do first is going to work on the lining first, because if we're going to have any errors, or I'm going to have to unpick anything because I'm not sure what I'm doing, I want to do it with the lining, not with my main pattern pieces. So I'm going to put those to one side, and I know that you might be itching to have a good old go with your outer fabric, but let's just do our testing and our practicing on our little pattern pieces here first. So we're just going to keep these all lined up together, and then we can start and look at the instructions and start and see where we are, and we're hopefully guaranteed the best part for success. So get your get your lining pieces out for your hood, and we'll start with the instructions of how to sew these together. So I think straight off we're going to be in one of the most confusing places that we've been to with these pattern pieces so far, because we've got pattern pieces that don't fit exactly on top of each other in order to sew straightly. But your clue all the way is going to be your markings for your Tailors Tacks. Let me just work out where I need to be for you to be able to see this properly. Is your Tailors Tacks. So I've separated these out, so we've got 2 pairs of pieces. So we've got, that's the one piece of the hood, and this is the other. And I've made sure that all of these dots here are down towards the bottom of the pattern piece, okay? So all 4 dots on those pieces are down towards the bottom. That's the first starting point. The next thing we're going to do then is turn these over so that we've got our points, our dots are going to sort of be matching each other, and then we're going to be lining up this edge here. But you see how I mean, how it doesn't line up perfectly, and therefore it's going to feel like it's strange. So we're going to start with this top edge, and we're going to match up this top point here, and we can see that curve going off there. We're not sewing that, so don't worry. And then just put a pin at the top, just to hold that starting point. We're then going to go down to the bottom here, and we're going to put our dots on top of each other so that we can sew this bottom piece. And the bottom edge of this dot is going to be slightly longer than the other, so don't worry about that. If you're not too sure, put a pin through the centre of your dot there, and a pin through the centre of your dot there, and then just smoosh those together, and you'll know you're in the right place. So again, just put your pin through on there. And then what we're going to do now is match up our notches. So we've got a notch just there and a notch just there, if you can see those. Might not be able to see on the white, but you might be able to see better on the red. So a notch there and a notch there. And I'm just going to put those together and mark it with a pin. It's very close to that one, but don't worry. and then another pin there. So I'm not marking in between those notches because that's going to be where we're going to leave it open for Luna and her friend's ears. Now on here we've got a curve that doesn't quite fit together, so we're going to do something called easing in. Can you see if we try and lie those together, we're getting a bit of a bump, and it's just because of the curve. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the centre and we're going to try and match that together so that we've got the same amount of bump, if you like, either side, and that our raw edges together, and then we put a pin in that centre point. What to do then is go to the centre here, and then I smoosh it down again so that there's an equal amount either side, and I put a pin in there. This is called easing in, and what it just means that one curve is slightly longer than the other. And again here, still not sitting straight, is it, for us? So again, into the middle, make sure your raw edges are together because that will take up some of the slack that we need, and then put a pin in again in the middle. And when we sew this together, I'm going to sew it, so you can see there how that is slightly bumpy. It's not quite as smooth as we would normally like, but that's okay because we're sewing a curve. I'm going to put the curved, the side with the bumps, down against the feed dogs underneath and sew from the top, and just take it nice and steady, and those fibres should all smoosh in together and should all give us a nice flat seam. But when we open it out, it's going to be nice and curvy. The other thing to remember is that here we're not going to be sewing, so we don't sew between these two notches. We leave that open because that's going to be where Luna's ears will poke out of her, or Wilhelmina's ears will poke out of the hood of the cape. So that's one side pinned. So let's do exactly the same with the other side. So we've got our dots down in this bottom corner, and we're going to fold it over so that the dots are together. And we can just take our pin through the centre of the dot of one and put it through the centre of the dot on the other, and then we know that those two are lined up perfectly. And just put the pin in to hold that still. Okay, that edge starts to match nicely. Then we go to the top up here because that's our other match point. We know we want to start and stop in the right places, and we're going to put a pin at the top here. Again, identify then where your notches are. So there's one here, so let's put one at this point here because that's going to tell us where to start. And this is where you can use your colour coded pins if you want to. You know, sometimes I use, let's move that one down and I'll show you, I use red headed pins to say stop stitching or start stitching, and then I use my other pins. There's another red one, let's put one in just there instead of that blue one. And then if I use other colours, I know again not to sew between those two. Now you can see the difference in the two edges here. So again, we're going to go to the middle and just smoosh it down, making sure those raw edges are together. Because if you're a beginner, you might think, well, that's supposed to match the same shape, or B, these two lines are supposed to match together. And when we're garment sewing, sometimes when we're sewing what's called a princess seam, so on a bodice, we sometimes have a curve seam that follows the curve of the bust. And when we're doing that, we need to do this as well sometimes because one curve will be sharper than the other. And again, into the middle here. So again, all these tips that you're learning now with sewing for Luna absolutely translates itself to sewing garments for yourself or for children later on. Okay, so there we are. We've got all of these together, and when if we just put our hand on, we can see that those fibres do just smoosh in and will just lie flat. If they don't feel like they're lying quite flat enough when you smoosh it, just move your pin slightly, and you should be able to just get them to smoosh in just nicely. And we'll start and sew this. So I'm going to lie and I've got thread in my machine now. I'm going to start and stop backwards and forwards, and then we're going to follow this line down, okay, and start and stop at the dot, which is what Sarah says to do in the book. So we're going to do our 1 centimetre seam allowance not all the way down to here, and stop to our red pin and stop, break our threads off, come back again, start and stop there, and then come all the way down here. And we're going to do the same on both sides. So I'll just come back to you when I've just done that. So we're just going to line our fabric up. We're going to use the markings on the fabric bed on here that tell us the different measurements. And again, we've got here a 1 centimetre seam allowance there, so we can follow that round with the edge of our fabric as well to know that we're in the right place. So we're starting at the very top, so take our pin out before we start. Get my pin cushion ready. around my foot pedal, and we're going to reverse stitch to start off with. Just using a 2.2 stitch length, and then we're just going to follow this round. We've got to stop almost as soon as we start, so a couple of stitches closer so that we know where we are. I'm going to take that pin out before I hit it. I just want to do one more stitch, and then reverse. There we go, and that'll just tie that off neatly for us. And then I'm just going to break my threads with my snips. Take off the starting threads. So literally I've just done a couple of centimetres. And then we're going to join our thread again, matching up our 1 centimetre seam allowance on the edge of our sewing. Take the pin out, hold on to our threads, forward a couple of stitches, back a couple of stitches, and then we're just going to follow this round now. We can put our needle in there to protect our work, can't we, and stop that from moving. And then we're just going to make sure that as this goes round, we're just helping that ease in. And the feed dogs underneath should just help with feeding that in. And if you feel like you just need to ease the tension, just lift the presser foot up and just neaten your fabrics, because mine was just starting to go slightly off so the raw edges weren't together, and then just put it back down again, and that'll help as well. So a few stitches around this edge, and then we're aiming for that dot, aren't we? Take the pin out at the last minute, and then we're reversing back on that dot. Take our pins out. Let's take our needle out of our work. Sometimes I say the wrong thing, don't I? So here we've got a short one there. This was between our notches, so we've got a notch there and a notch there. So we've stopped and started there, and then we've carried on down to the notch. And our moment of truth. So this side looks a little bit bobbly, but that's okay. We've not got any puckers in there, so that's all fine. Well, it's a bit messy on the back there, isn't it? But then when we fold this over, that extra fabric is going to give us that nice curve that we need to the hood, so that when we've got this for Luna, it's got a nice curve on it for the hood to give her a nice shape on the back of the head. Okay, so before we do anything with that one, let's go on to the next one. This one, at time I've turned it upside down. I'm going to start on the dot this time. So get that lined up. I'm going to lower my needle in, take my pin out, because now I'm happy that I've anchored that all together. Just be aware here about those edges, because on that curve they just seem to want to jump out of the way. So let's just start, a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back, and now we're just helping the fabric just go round, so we're not pushing it, but we're just kind of encouraging it to go around that curve. And keeping those raw edges together, remember, that's really important. Just keeping our 1 centimetre seam allowance. Take our pin out when we get there. Oops, might go my pin cushion. Again, nice and steady. Don't have to go zooming. Pin out again. Now that was the blue pin, and I think that was on the notch. Let me just check. Where's my notch? Just there. No, a couple more stitches forward. See, I should have used my red pin and then I'd have known, wouldn't I? That's that. So it's easy to forget. If you do forget, all you have to do is just get your unpicker out and just go back and redo those. Undo where you needed to, and then just reinforce where you needed to as well. Oops, get that straight under there. Take that first pin out, a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back, and then, oops, careful with our pins, and off to the edge and just reverse. Just wanting to bunch my fabric up a little bit there. Okay. So there we go. So again, we can see that we've got a little bit of bunching up there, but it's not actually puckered at all. and then when we turn that round, that's going to be lovely and smooth. So next thing we're going to do is just take this to the ironing board, and we're going to press this, and we need to press these seams open. So first thing I'm going to do is just use my iron and just gently just press those stitches just to make them lay flat. Try not to press any puckering into that seam at all, so just use the nose of your iron. And I'm doing it from the curvy side just so that I can see where that all is and how that's all laying. And then the next thing I'm going to do is use my tailor's ham. So you might have seen one of these. It's a pad, it's filled with sawdust, I believe. It's called a tailor's ham, and what you can do is you can put things that have got curves on them over the edge, and then you can press it. So on this case we've got a nice curve here that we want to press, and we can press that over here. You can use a rolled up tea towel or towel as well, a little hand towel, and that will also work. And then we can just press that seam open there. And again down the bottom here, we can just press that open. You can also try and do it just by putting it on your sewing machine bed like this and just doing a little bit, but have the part of it held up so that you can work with it, because you're wanting to press that seam into where you're working. You don't want to get rid of it. So again, it just depends on what works best for you. And once you've got it pushed out one side, I would go on and just use the nose of your iron again to just press that. And although we've got this opening here, we still want to press that flat with that seam allowance at 1 centimetre, because we're going to join that together later, and that's where Luna's going to put her hands through, her ears through later. So we do want that to be nice and neat on an edge, so do press that section too. So let me just go ahead and do this other one, this section there. So again, we've got our 2 openings for our ears, one there and one there, and this is the 2 sides. So this is going to be the front of the hood, and then we'll join those 2 bits together to be the back of the hood. So let's just go on to the next stage and we'll see what we've got to do next. So the next stage is then that with both of our curvy pieces, these curvy pieces here together at the back, and this straight edge, and making sure that both of the ear slits are at the top. So we've got both sets of our tailor's tacks, our white tailor's tacks, down at the bottom here. We can match up this centre seam just here to make sure that they're going to line up on top of each other, and those corners just there. And this should match perfectly if we've been following our 1 centimetre seam allowance. And then let's go back to the end, because we like to do this, don't we? Go back to the end and match that up. There we go. And then on this back edge we've got 2 notches. We've got 2 notches there and 2 notches there. Is it 2 notches or 1 notch? 2 notches, I think. And we're going to match those up. And that should now lie perfectly together, so because these curves match perfectly. So we've done that, and now we're going to start here at the front edge, so away from where the bottom edge, start at the front edge here, and then we're going to sew all the way around here to here and start and stop at the end. So let's just do that bit. Sometimes on these pattern pieces it's not difficult sewing, it's just finding your orientation and not getting confused with which bit goes where, and I think that's sometimes the difficult bit. A couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back, just to reinforce that, and put our needle in our work, because we're going to be working with our pins, and we're going to just make sure that this is kind of folded into itself, so you can see how it's curving up and away from the bed. And that'll just help this edge stay flat. So we're just going to go straight across here, keeping our 1 centimetre seam allowance towards this pin. And take our pin out. And we're going straight across before then we start to go down. Now, again, we can lift up our presser foot with our needle in our work, and we can manipulate this round. So just take a couple of stitches at a time if you need to. This is quite a gentle curve, so it should go round quite nicely for you, but if you find you're struggling, just lift your presser foot up and just move it so that you're sewing in the right direction, because your sewing machine can only sew straight, and your feed dogs will only feed the fabric straight. So if you do have to go round a curve, that's what you need to do just to help it. You just need to help change the direction on the feed dogs underneath, which is those rough bits underneath the presser foot on the bed of the sewing machine, and they will then help you feed the fabric through. So pins out, down at the bottom here. So let's just keep that 1 centimetre seam allowance, because we know that's important. Reverse, and then needle out of the work, and we can sew our threads off. Now we don't need to neaten any of these seams because they will all be hidden inside. This is going to be the positive of this type of sewing practice, is that the rough seams are all going to be inside. So there we go. Got our 2 clear slits at the top, always a good thing. And then we've then got the rest of our seams inside. So what we're going to do now is we'll press this flat first, and then we'll open that seam and press it open using our tailor's ham again, or your rolled up towel that you've got. Just you can use that to make it into the right shape you need, so that you can just push it inside here to press these seams open. The other thing that I'm going to do is here is where we've got this little flap. I'm going to take that little flap off at a diagonal, and that will just reduce bulk in these seams when it's trying to lie flat. So again, this side, it's just the top of the seam allowance, so I'm not compromising the seam at all. I'm just going across at a diagonal, so starting at this stitched edge here and finishing at the top of the edge here, and I can just snip that off and snip that one off gently. So literally you're just taking off a small amount, but then when you open this out, because the seam allowance here is going to be opened up and go back on itself, it just takes away some of the bulk in that place and just makes it lie nice and flat for you. So that's what we're going to do. Let's get this pressed. So first of all, let's press this flat here. That just sets the stitches into the work. And then we can open this out now. And you can see now that this is too tight a curve really to get your iron right in there. You might be able to, if you've got one of those little mini irons. But I'm just going to press the seam allowance open, and we want it flat against the bed of the ironing board. So just use your fingers to finger press it if needs be, and start it off on there if we can. And again here, just open it up if you can. Let it lie flat against the bed of the ironing board. And then we're going to use the corner of our ham if we can, if it will fit on. That's not going to fit on very well, is it? Oh, I know what, I've got another one here. I've got this other sausage roll one, haven't I? Wish it was a real sausage roll, that'd be nice, wouldn't it? And then we can just pop that in there. So you generally buy these as a set of 2, so hopefully you've got these, or if not, just again, just rearrange how your towel's rolled up, just so you can press that seam open, and just watch your fingers while you're manipulating this. Turn off your steam as well, you don't want to be steaming any of your fingers. And then we can turn it over, put it back over the edge of the seam, and then we can just press that open as well. Just pull the fabric to one side, and that'll just help it be flat. And again on the top bit here, it's just going to crinkle a little bit, but I don't think I mind too much about that. And there we go, we have one hood started to be made. Now I'm going to carry on and make the rest of the hood, the rest of the lining for the hood first before I start to work on my top fabric. But the construction of the main hood is exactly the same. So I'm going to say waste your time. I don't mean that in the wrong way, but I think that you'll be able to just go back and watch the same video for making this hood and do it exactly the same way but with your top fabric, and then that should be all straight for you. So it should be easy to follow. So I've documented in the description anyway the order of things, so you'll be able to follow it. So just look back on the chapters for sewing the hood, and that will then help you remind you about what you were doing with the hood. If you can remember, then great, just go ahead and just sew it up. But sometimes getting the orientation of this front and this back piece together was the trickiest bit, I think, and sewing that curve. So if you've got that, then you've already got that. So I'm going to start and move on now to the body of the cape. So now we're going to have the body of the cape, and what I want to do is just try and get our orientation right. We know we've got the back piece here, which will go around the back of the cape. We've got a nice fullness there. And then we know we've got a front of the cape and we've got a side front. Now the clues again on this are going to be our notches and our tailor's tacks, because we've got 2 tailor's tacks just here, a bit of an errant black thread there, and we've got 2 tailor's tacks here. And we know that where she puts her arms through the cape, we want those bits to be in the same place, so that's actually going to be our friend. So let's just put the back out of the way for the minute, but because we're happy that we've got both pieces, and let's lay these pieces here out the same way that we did the others. We know this long straight edge here, this is the mark for the clasp for the neck, so we know that that's going to be at the centre front, because that's going to be the clasp that just is this bit here, look, just a little hook and eye for the centre front. So we know that that's the right way round, rather than it being, so we know that that's not the straight edge that we're going to have as the opening. And then with these 2 here, we now need to match these up so that we've got our tailor's tacks together, or your marks together. Hopefully you can see this. It looks a little bit dark on my screen, but hopefully you can see okay. So again, we've got our notches there to match together, and our marks here and notches on the side here to match together, and then we've got the centre front here. So again, these little tailor's tacks and all the markings are actually all your clues, like I've said before, as to where we're sewing. So what I'm going to do is take this one over here, we're going to match up this bottom edge and put a pin in, make sure that's spot on, and we're going to go up to this neck edge and make sure that the neck edge on those very points match as well. I'm then going to go to the 2 notches that we've got for our armholes, if you want, and I'm going to put a red pin in because that's going to tell me to stop sewing, and we're going to have another one just here, which also is going to tell me to stop and start sewing, and those dots there should be on top of each other as well. If you need to, put another pin in here. I don't think you need another one here, but then that's that one ready to sew. So again, let's go on to this one, and let's just fold this one over the top here so that we've got our tailor's tacks matching. Find the bottom, put a pin in, then go to the top edge here, and you can see how different those 2 points are. So we're going to just match the points together and a pin in there. And then we're going to come down here to where our notches are again, match those up, and again I'm going to mark that with a red pin to tell me to stop stitching, if I remember, that I should. And then again here, another one in there too. And then again, if you want to put another notch in there, you can do, but it's sitting very nicely, so it doesn't feel to me like it needs one. But if you want to have one in, just pop one in, and it'll just hold it together for you and make sure that you're there. So we're going to start here, a centimetre in, start and stop here, and then we're going to again start and stop there, break our threads, and then rejoin here, start and stop, and then go down to the bottom. And we're going to do that on both sides. So let's just do that. So lining it up with the edge on my machine, I'm going to do a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back, just to hold on to that edge, reinforce it, needle in my work so that I can be pulling my pins out and it's not going to make my stitches go jagged. And then we can now just sew down here, just make sure we don't sew over our pins, and then down to our next one. And this is a red one, so we know we're going to start and stop. So I'm going to get close to it and take my pin out, and then a stitch, 2 stitches forward on that one, and that's it, and then just back. Moving out of my work, cut my threads and cut the starting and finishing threads. If we cut our threads as we go along, it does help us not have to go around chasing them all at the end. And then I'm going to rejoin now where this red one is and leave this arm gap open. So with this one, I'm just going to line it up. I'm just going to then take my pin out, making sure I've not moved off my pin. Put a needle in my work to hold it still. A couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back. Take the pin out at the bottom. Reverse at the end there. Needle up. And then we can just take our threads out there. Okay, so that's what we've got. And when we're going to press this one again, we're going to press this one open, but we're going to maintain that 1 centimetre seam allowance even though this gap is open. So if we press our work first like this, and then we're going to press it open again like this. And we've got a slight curve on this, so it's not going to lie flat on your ironing board very easily. So just do a little bit at a time, open it out, do a little bit, and then just encourage that curve, because it's that curve which will kind of cups and gives it the shape for the body that we want. Okay, so let's just sew the other one. Just, I would say quickly, but I don't want you to sew quickly. I just want you to take your time. It's just a little seam, isn't it? So it doesn't take too long. Slow down when you come into your pin. Just take your pin out when your needle's in your work. A couple of stitches more forward onto that dot and then back, just to secure that. Needle up, cut our threads. And then down, rejoin at the bottom here. So I'm going to put press the foot down first to hold it still, then take out my pin, and then holding onto my threads I can drop my needle down into the work. A couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back. Stop before we get to the next pin. And off the end with a reverse stitch just at the end, just to reinforce that bottom seam. Okay, so we've got a left and a right done now of our fronts. We know this is the centre front because that's the marking for the neck clasp, for the hook and eye at the neck, and there's our other one. So this is all coming together, isn't it? So let's now go over to the ironing board and we'll just press these. So first of all, with any of our seams, we're going to press it flat first. And that's quite easy to do because it's lying quite nicely. And then the next thing that we're going to do now is start and open up this seam here. So I'm going to open up this little bit first here and press it flat, just up to that mark. And then I'm going to go down to the other section, open that out with my fingers. And if I need to, I'm just going to lift that other section up because it just helps it just keep that curve. And I'm pressing now to that curve. And now if I just put my fingers underneath, I can just lift this other section up just to keep that curve in there, but just to press that seam allowance open. And then once I've done that, put it down. But again, I'm going to just fold it back the other way, just gently. And we just want to keep that curve there, which is the nice little opening for Luna to put her hands through. So again, I keep saying Luna, but you can use any character. It could be Otterline, couldn't it? It could be any of them who are wearing this lovely cape. But I suppose Luna is the name that comes to mind first of all for mine. But as I say, I use the character names interchangeably. And then over this way. And just press that all nice and flat like that. Okay, so we can see nice and clearly with these Tailors Tacks where our slits start and finish. I'm going to leave those in still for the moment because that still helps us with marking things up. But the next thing I think that we're going to do now is attach the front to the back. So we're starting to come together, folks. So again, we're going to get, started with again, but that's not necessarily true, is it? So we're going to get our back piece now and lay that down, so face side up. And then we're going to use our markings for the notch, for the neck edge, because that looks quite similar, doesn't it? And we're going to remember that those need to be in towards the middle. So just lay the pattern pieces down, your fabric pieces down with your marking, your Tailors Tacks for the centre, notch for the clasp at the front, and then you'll be on the right orientation. They're going to overlap slightly. Don't worry about that at this stage. All we want to do now is match this top point here. Making sure they're lined up perfectly. And then we go down to the bottom and match up the bottom edge perfectly. And then we're just going to make sure that these raw edges are all together properly. and put our pins in. We don't need to worry about red and pins on this bit because we're not going to start and stop. We're just going to go all the way down and just sew from here all the way down to the outside edge. So again here, because I'm going to sew from the other side this time, I'm going to pin from the other side. No reason for that other than it's just when you put in the sewing machine you normally sew from that end, and I don't really want to sew from this end up, so for me I'm just going to just pin this from the back and it'll just make it right. I usually try and sew in the direction that a garment's being worn if I can, so from the shoulders down towards the hem. I think I've seen somewhere on YouTube or Pinterest or somewhere that it does help with the stress lines sometimes for the garments, if there are any, if it's all sewn the same way. So again, we did have notches on the back here, so we can match up our notches there and there. And again, the notches are matched up here and here, so they're our clue as well that we're on the right edge, because this front edge here doesn't have any notches at all. So again, if you can't find any notches, just make sure you've got your orientation of your front pieces right. And now that we've got that done, all we're going to do now is just start and stop at the top, all the way down to the bottom, sew and stop at the bottom, and then when we finish, we're going to press it flat with our iron, and then we're going to press that seam open and try and keep the curve, because we've got quite a nice curve on there, keep the curve going as well. So let's go and do that. Make sure you can see, and you can hopefully. So a couple of stitches forward and back, just back tack. Needle in the work, but we want to miss our pins. Keep your work flat because you're sewing around a curve again, and so your fabric is, you can't have your fabric like that because you're going to sew all of these ridges into it. So allow your fabric to lie flat on the top of your sewing bed, and if you need to change the direction, I'll show you what to do. So we're going to carry on first because we're all right at the moment, and we can just, I'm just putting a little bit of pressure with my fingers in that direction just to kind of move the fabric across, but not so much that it causes it to lift off the, can you see how it's lifting off the presser bed just here? You want to keep that flat all the time. So let's just try and do a little bit more, see if we can get around a bit more. Now it's starting to not want to go, so I'm going to lift up my presser foot and just twist it slightly so that the next centimetre or two I can sew straight. So a couple more stitches till it starts to go off again. You can see on the fabric on the edge of the presser foot, look. Then I lift up the presser foot again, and this is the beauty of having your needle in your work. So always hand crank it down if you haven't got an automatic one like I have. Always hand crank it down just to make sure that needle's staying in your work. And then a few more stitches, and we're over around where the shoulders are, so the curve isn't quite as strong. So a couple more stitches before we take that out. But just assess each time as you're going round. It just depends if you can encourage the fabric round without it bunching up under your needle, then do that. But if you need to stop and just lift that presser foot, and they call it pivoting, if you need to pivot, because once that needle's in your work, you can move your fabric wherever you want, but the needle will hold it still. So again, that's what we want it to do. We want it to be able to pivot on that point, and then down to the hem. And as I say, we've got to be really careful to keep our seam allowance nice and even and at 1 centimetre, because we want this all to match up perfectly at the end. If it doesn't, I'm going to show you some tips, but the best way of doing it is making sure that you can then sew this as straight as possible with the same seam allowance all the way through. So lovely neat stitching there, no little jigs in our sewing at all, and even where we stop to change direction, we've got a nice smooth curve. So we're going to do the same with this side now. Match up for our seam allowance, a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back, and then I'm already going to put my needle in my work and take this first pin out. And it's that bit there really which is the sharpest of the curve. So a few stitches forward, just encouraging it, starting to veer off too much, so I'm just going to lift up my presser foot, straighten the fabric out underneath a little bit. You're not trying to go all the way, it's just in stages. And then sewing down again. Remember to stop for your pins. Sometimes you can be concentrating so much on your curves you forget about your pins, and then the rest of it is fairly gentle. And then down to the bottom and reverse. I'm just going to take our needle up and take our threads off. And there we have a beautifully sewn cape lining. So what we're going to do now is take this to the ironing board and press these open. So as always, I always press it flat first, both sides, and then I'm going to open it out. And let's just see, we've got a nice curve there, so let's just see if we can press the first little bit open first without having to put it on the ham. Just use your finger just to make sure that's lying nice and flat against the ironing board, and we can get so far, and then I can feel it starting to resist that curve. And again here, let's just open it up a little bit with our finger. I'm just looking for that seam to be lying flat. And pressing it now will really help when you come to put the lining together, because it'll make sure that all these seams allowances lie flat. So we can only do a little bit of this, but let's just start it off. That'll just encourage it. And then I'm going to use my tailor's ham again. Just put the curve of the shoulder onto the edge here. Find a nice place where it fits nicely. Right on the other one, that might be a bit too shallow of a curve. Let's try this one a bit better, I think. Oops, it's a bit higher though for you to see, isn't it? Probably felt like I was about to poke you in the face. Right, here we go. So pressing that seam open, and you can just put a little bit of tension on there just to help pull it flat, and then just use the iron just to hold that down. Okay, and then we can just turn it around the other way and use the body of the ham. These are really great shape, great for on a Christmas present list if you're wanting something sewn related. I use mine quite a lot actually. So just come in really handy. Let's just start that little bit there off, and you can see how it curves round for the character's shoulders. So I'm just going to start and the stop, and then I'm just going to work on this main bit of the curve just there. Look, just make sure it's lying nice and flat. And then we can do that one. Let's do the other one. I know you all know how to iron and press clothes, and we do enough of that in our lives, don't we? But sometimes when you're fiddling around with little bits, I think it's quite nice to see how people actually handle things and manipulate things. If I just come back to you with a finished ironed shoulder point and you think, how's she managed to do that? Then I just think it helps just to see sometimes. So fast forward if you've already got this. That's the beauty of a video, isn't it? You can just fast forward, you don't have to sit through it if you don't want to. But again, if you just like watching what's happening, then it can be quite nice, can't it? Okay, that's that one done. So let's just now press this one open the other way. And if you can get in the habit of pressing your work as you're doing it, you will notice a difference. It does elevate the finish, because once these have been pressed and got the memory of the seam pressed into them, it does then kind of hold that shape much nicer. So again, just fold it over and just press it on that shoulder. Okay, so there's the body of our cape. Now, because we've pressed that really nicely, I'm not going to tack that back, but if you wanted to, feel free just to put some run some quick tacking stitch around. I mean, Sarah does recommend that in the book, but this is pressed really nicely, so I'm not going to worry too much. That one's just come out slightly, but just give it a quick press again. And it depends on your fabric as well. If your fabric's a little bit bouncy and that's not keeping that curve nice, this is 100% cotton, so it does keep a nice curve. But if it's not for you, then just, as I say, just run a row of tacking stitches just to hold that seam allowance back for you. I mean, when it's together, you want it to look nice and almost seamless, but you can just tack around there. It'll just hold. We're going to slip stitch that to the lining to the main fabric at a later stage. So you just stitching the seam allowance down so that you can then work with that later. It's up to you. Okay, let's back to the table. I've now got our front cape and, well, our main cape and our hood all lined together. So now what I'm going to go and do is get my main fabric pieces, and I'm going to start with the 2 hood pieces like we did before. And I'm just going to do exactly the same as what we've done before. So I'm going to open these out so that they're together, like that. And then I'm going to open these out so that these are together. And then matching our two corresponding Tailors tacks. That was our starting point, if you remember, because these curves, these pieces don't look the same because they're a front and a back. So again, with your pattern pieces, just put them to one side. I tend to keep them in a little freezer bag like this with it labelled up. Keep your pattern pieces all together so you've got them, because I can assure you're going to want to make more of these, because it's turning out to be super cute, this cape is. And I thought just in time for Christmas as well, for dressing these characters. So again, just put your pins in through your hole, through your Tailors tack first, match up this end point, and then we're going to just do the same thing that we did before. We're going to keep an eye out for our holes for our ears, which are marked by our notches. Where have they gone? One just there, that's it, they're on top of each other. So again, where's that red pin? So I want to start and stop there, start and stop there for Luna's ears. And because we've already practiced once with the lining fabric, we know this is going to go together really nicely. So again, we can just pop that on together there. And we just work our way through it. So I'm just going to join you when I've got all of this. If you need to go back and look at anything, then just use the prompts on the video in the time bar below, and you can go backwards and forwards and just go back to that part again where we just did the lining, the hood lining before, and copy that exactly. Okay, I'm moving on. I'll carry on with this and come back to you.